After a long week of endless meetings, all he wanted was silence, a window seat, and a few hours of peace on his flight home. But the moment he stepped onto the plane, that peace shattered, because someone was already sitting in the seat he paid for. What unfolded next would ignite a battle of respect in front of the entire cabin and force the airline to face a truth it could no longer ignore. After a demanding week filled with back-to-back meetings, endless phone calls, and the constant weight of decisions that only seemed to multiply, he finally allowed himself a small breath of relief as he wheeled his modest carry-on bag through the polished floors of the airport. For most travelers, the terminal was a place of chaos, lines stretching endlessly, the shuffle of rushed feet, the impatient sighs echoing from gate to gate. But for him, it had become a ritual, almost a moment of calm before stepping into the skies. He always arrived early, not because he feared missing his flight, but because he valued the rhythm of observing life around him. Businessmen with their laptops open at charging stations, families huddled together with restless children, couples holding hands as though the trip ahead might change everything. These scenes reminded him of why he worked so hard. He carried himself with quiet confidence, never loud, never hurried, but always steady, as though even the bustling airport could not shake his composure. When the boarding call finally echoed, he moved with practiced ease, scanning his pass, offering the flight attendant a polite nod, and stepping into the narrow jet bridge that smelled faintly of fuel and recycled air. He had been waiting for this moment all day, the comfort of a familiar seat, 2A, a window view that let him disappear into the clouds. That seat was not just upholstery and a number to him, it was a reward, a reminder that the years of grinding work and sacrifices had built a life where he could now enjoy small luxuries. Every flight, seat 2A became his sanctuary, a place where the world outside couldn't demand anything of him. He imagined resting his head, watching the city lights fade below, and finally sinking into silence. But as he turned into the first-class cabin, his steps slowed. There, sitting casually with her legs crossed, scrolling on her phone as if nothing in the world was out of place, was a woman occupying his seat. At first, he thought perhaps she had made a mistake. Mistakes happened all the time. Someone misreading a boarding pass, mixing up rows, or not realizing they had walked into the wrong section. He approached calmly, his voice low but firm, asking her to check her ticket. Without lifting her eyes from her screen, she simply waved her hand, dismissive, as though he were nothing more than background noise. The irritation in her gesture was sharp, not of someone embarrassed by an error, but of someone convinced she didn't need to explain herself at all. He cleared his throat, holding his boarding pass where the seat number was clearly printed, but she finally glanced up, smirked slightly, and said she was fine where she was. Her words weren't just defiant. They dripped with entitlement, as though she had claimed the seat by mere presence, and his insistence was nothing more than an inconvenience to her comfort. The cabin, though filled with the soft rustle of passengers stowing bags and settling in, seemed to pause. A few nearby travelers turned their heads, their curiosity piqued by the rising tension. Eyes flicked from the woman in the seat to the man standing in the aisle, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as he held back the sharp retort forming in his mind. Passengers often noticed things like this, though many pretended not to. A man in the row across leaned back to watch discreetly, his brows furrowing in quiet disapproval. A couple sitting diagonally whispered softly to one another, their expressions somewhere between intrigue and discomfort. Even the attendant near the cabin door lingered a moment longer than necessary, sensing a situation building but hesitant to step in too soon. The hum of conversation in the cabin softened, as if everyone subconsciously wanted to hear what would happen next. The man didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his way. Instead, he explained once more, carefully but firmly, that the seat she was in had been assigned to him. He had paid for it, chosen it specifically, and her refusal to move was not only inconsiderate but unjust. Yet she leaned back, unbothered, scrolling again on her phone as if his words carried no weight at all. The dismissiveness stung more than outright hostility might have. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about respect, the principle of acknowledging another person's right to what they had earned. As moments stretched into uncomfortable silence, the cabin seemed to shrink around them. The passengers nearby no longer tried to hide their interest, and the tension became thick, almost tangible. A young man a few rows back raised his phone slightly, the telltale red light flashing as he began to record. The businessman noticed, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't embarrassed. If anything, the silent audience only strengthened his resolve. He had faced tougher negotiations in glass-walled boardrooms where millions were at stake. A seat on a plane should have been simple. Yet here he was, standing at the edge of a conflict he hadn't sought, but one he knew he could not simply walk away from. In that moment, the simple act of reclaiming seat 2A became symbolic. It was no longer just about comfort or preference. It was about drawing a line against being silenced, against letting someone's arrogance erase the value of his presence. And though no one yet knew how far this battle would go, the first sparks of it had already ignited, leaving the cabin, waiting, restless, for the storm to unfold. The quiet tension that hung in the cabin finally broke when the lead flight attendant stepped forward. Her name tag read Kelly, and though her smile was professional, there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She had clearly seen enough to understand what was happening, yet instead of addressing the woman in the seat, she turned toward the man standing firmly in the aisle. Her tone was calm, almost too soft, but her words carried the subtle weight of authority as she asked him to take another seat so that boarding could continue smoothly. The businessman's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected support, expected her to enforce what was clearly right, but instead she seemed eager to quiet the disturbance by shifting the burden onto him. It was a familiar pattern, one he had witnessed before, when someone who made things uncomfortable was asked to be the one to yield, even when they were in the right. He responded in the same measured voice he always carried in boardrooms, never raising it, never letting anger cloud his words. He explained that this was not just about a chair or an airline policy. This was about respect, about being acknowledged for something he had rightfully purchased and chosen. His boarding pass was not a suggestion. It was a contract. And yet, here he was being told to move as though his claim didn't matter. The woman in his seat remained silent, her eyes fixed on her phone as though the conflict didn't involve her at all. Kelly's smile strained as she tried to smooth the moment, insisting that they could sort this out later, but for now, would he kindly sit elsewhere so they could prepare for departure? The businessman stood his ground. He did not raise his voice, but the firmness in his refusal left no room for compromise. He would not move. This was not negotiable. His calmness carried more weight than shouting ever could, and the firmness in his stance unsettled Kelly. She shifted uncomfortably, glanced back toward the galley, and soon returned with another attendant. This second figure, a man with sharp features and a clipped tone, wasted no time in reinforcing the same message. He suggested that the gentleman was holding up the flight, and that it would be best for everyone if he took another available seat. His words were more forceful, laced with the kind of impatience that made clear he was less concerned about fairness and more about efficiency. The woman in the seat smirked faintly, as though reassured that the staff were leaning in her favor. The businessman repeated his stance with unwavering calm. He would not move, and no amount of polite suggestions or stern commands would change that. The passengers around them leaned closer, no longer hiding their interest. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin, little murmurs of disbelief that the airline staff seemed determined to push the man aside rather than address the obvious wrong. A passenger seated across the aisle whispered to her husband, shaking her head in quiet disapproval. A man a few rows back muttered under his breath about entitlement, while another continued to record with his phone, the small red light still glowing. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. What had started as a small confrontation over a seat was becoming something larger, something that touched everyone watching. Then, in a voice steady and deliberate, the businessman addressed not just the attendants, but the entire cabin. He turned slightly so that his words carried across the rows, his tone calm but powerful, the kind of voice that demanded attention, without needing to shout. He explained that this moment was not isolated. Too often, people were asked to shrink themselves for the comfort of others, asked to yield even when they had every right to stand firm. He spoke of how silence often became the expected price of peace, how those who spoke up were painted as disruptive, while those who overstepped faced no consequence. The cabin grew quieter still, the weight of his words pressing on every listener. Heads nodded subtly, eyes widened, and the murmurs shifted from doubt to agreement. His words struck a chord, not just because of what he said, but because of the dignity with which he said it. The attendants exchanged nervous glances. This was no longer a private dispute. It had become a spectacle, one with an audience increasingly sympathetic to the man in the aisle. Pressure built in the air, not just on him, but on the airline itself, whose staff seemed unwilling to enforce fairness. The second attendant's confidence faltered as the passengers' stares sharpened, as if silently demanding that justice be done. Kelly, still clutching her tablet, finally excused herself to call in the captain. The murmurs swelled again as the announcement spread. When the captain was summoned, it meant the situation had reached a point of no return. Moments later, the cabin door opened and the captain stepped inside. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor calm, but there was a weight in his gaze as he looked between the man in the aisle, the woman lounging in 2A, and the staff standing uneasily to the side. The silence that followed was heavy. Every passenger holding their breath, waiting to see which side authority would choose. Would the captain, too, ask the man to move, or would he finally address the entitlement of the woman who had refused? To yield? The standoff had reached its peak, and the resolution, whatever it would be, would set the tone for everyone watching. The captain stood in the aisle with the kind of authority that silenced even the most restless passengers. His presence carried weight, and for a moment it felt as though order would be restored. He listened carefully as the attendants explained the dispute, their voices laced with unease before turning to the businessman. Calmly, the man handed over his boarding pass the evidence of his claim printed clearly in black and white. The captain studied it with a measured eye, glanced at the seat number, and then looked directly at the woman still seated in 2A. His words were clear and decisive. The seat was indeed assigned to the man standing before him. It was not a matter of confusion or a clerical mistake. It was his seat, and there was no room for argument. The cabin seemed to release a collective breath, as though the authority they had been waiting for had finally spoken. Yet the woman's reaction was not what anyone expected. She did not move. She crossed her arms, lifted her chin, and with an air of stubborn pride, declared that she would not be getting up. Shock rippled through the passengers. To defy the attendants was one thing, but to openly refuse the captain of the aircraft was another. A hush fell over the rows as the weight of her refusal sank in. The businessman's eyes remained steady, his voice calm as he reiterated his stance. He would not sit anywhere else. If she refused to move, then the flight would not leave the ground. His words carried no anger, only certainty, but the implications were heavy. He was grounding the plane with his refusal, forcing the airline to confront the problem directly. The tension thickened, each second stretching into eternity as everyone waited to see who would break first. Whispers stirred again through the cabin, but this time they were not murmurs of uncertainty. Passengers began to voice their support, aloud, no longer content to remain silent observers. A woman across the aisle spoke firmly, saying he was right to stand his ground. Another passenger further back agreed loudly, pointing out that the ticket clearly proved his claim. Even those who stayed quiet revealed their feelings through nods, folded arms, or looks of disapproval directed toward the woman still seated, in defiance. Phones continued to record, their red lights capturing every word, every expression. The man in the aisle was no longer standing alone. The cabin had become his chorus, rallying behind his resolve. The attendants, visibly shaken, realized the situation was spiraling beyond their control. The captain's authority had been challenged, and now passengers were beginning to turn against the airline itself. Unable to contain the matter, Kelly hurried down the aisle toward the front of the plane, her voice low but urgent as she called for management to intervene. Minutes passed that felt like hours, the air heavy with expectation. Then, from the jet bridge, two figures in dark suits entered the cabin. Airline management had arrived, their expressions serious, their steps deliberate. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the murmurs quieting as all eyes turned to the newcomers. The managers began their investigation with practiced calm. They asked for the tickets again, checked their tablets, and spoke quietly with the captain. Each time, the same truth came back. The man had been right all along. The seat was his, purchased and confirmed. The woman, however, clung desperately to her entitlement. She offered excuses, suggested the system was wrong, insisted that she deserved to stay where she was. Her tone was sharp, her body language defensive, but the harder she pushed, the more her credibility unraveled. The passengers watched her struggle, some with disbelief, others with visible frustration. What had begun as arrogance was now unraveling into humiliation, a refusal to face the reality that she had no claim. The businessman did not gloat. He did not smirk or raise his voice. He simply stood in silence, his presence steady, waiting for the truth that had already been proven to be acknowledged one final time. The managers exchanged glances, their patience thinning before addressing the cabin firmly. The man was the rightful occupant of seat 2A. There was no mistake, no loophole, no ground left for argument. The woman was to vacate the seat immediately or face removal from the flight. Their words were sharp, definitive, and left no room for her to hide. For a long moment, she didn't move. The cabin was utterly silent, every passenger holding their breath as the weight of the ultimatum sank in. Then, slowly, with visible reluctance, she rose from the seat. Her face flushed, her eyes darting nervously as she felt the stares of dozens of strangers pressing down on her. The silence broke not with whispers, but with the sound of scattered applause. It began with one passenger, then another, until the clapping spread through the cabin. The moment wasn't about triumph, but about relief, about the restoration of fairness that everyone had been waiting for. The woman, flustered and defeated, gathered her things and moved down the aisle, her confidence shattered. Management guided her away, their clipped voices offering no comfort. The businessman finally lowered himself into seat 2A, not with a sense of conquest, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had simply claimed what was his. The tension eased, passengers whispering again, this time with admiration for the man, who had stood his ground when it would have been easier to surrender. The storm had peaked, and the truth had prevailed, leaving the woman humiliated and the airline forced to face the consequences of its mishandling. The engines finally roared to life, and the plane began its slow crawl toward the runway, but the atmosphere inside the cabin carried a heaviness that even the anticipation of departure couldn't lift. Though order had been restored and the rightful passenger now sat in seat 2A, the echoes of the confrontation lingered in every corner of the space. Conversations were quieter than usual, glances were longer, and an unspoken awareness settled over the first-class cabin. Everyone had witnessed something more than a squabble over a chair. They had seen pride, injustice, defiance, and finally, The power of one person's refusal to yield when respect was at stake. The hum of the engines filled the silence, but beneath it lay the unshakable weight of reflection. The woman who had caused the turmoil sat farther back now, tucked into a seat she had neither chosen nor desired, her presence small and muted. She no longer carried the same air of confidence she had displayed earlier. Instead, she avoided eye contact. Her face turned toward the window, shoulders hunched as if trying to vanish from sight. The authority she had projected with her dismissive gestures and smug defiance was gone, stripped away by the undeniable truth and the judgment of dozens of watchful eyes. Her silence said more than words ever could. She had not just lost a seat, she had lost the illusion of entitlement that shielded her from accountability. For the other passengers, the moment became a mirror. Many of them replayed the confrontation in their minds, realizing how easily they might have stayed silent if the man had caved, how quickly they might have accepted the airline's request to avoid discomfort rather than fight for what was right. Some leaned toward one another, whispering their thoughts in hushed tones. One man admitted quietly to his seatmate that he had almost expected the businessman to give up, to take another seat like so many others would have. Another woman murmured that it was about time someone had drawn a line. Their reflections were not just about the flight, but about moments in their own lives when silence had seemed easier than standing firm. Through it all, the businessman sat with the same quiet dignity he had carried from the start. He did not smile in victory or seek validation from the passengers around him. He simply rested his head against the seat, finally claiming the small peace he had sought hours earlier. To him, it had never been about winning a fight. It had been about refusing to let his presence be diminished, about not shrinking to make room for someone else's arrogance. His resolve had spoken louder than anger ever could, and the respect in the glances he received from nearby passengers told him that others understood that truth. As the flight wore on, small gestures confirmed the impact of what had happened. A man across the aisle leaned over quietly to tell him he admired his patience. Another passenger, a woman with kind eyes, simply nodded at him as though to say thank you without words. Even those who did not speak made their feelings clear through. Small smiles, respectful glances, and the absence of judgment. The businessman accepted it all with grace, but inside, he knew this story could not end on the plane. He could not allow it to be remembered as just another uncomfortable incident swept under the rug by an airline eager to avoid scandal. When the plane finally touched down and passengers began to gather their belongings, he moved with the same unhurried confidence as before, yet his mind was already crafting the letter he would write. Not a complaint begging for compensation, not a demand for a voucher or a hollow apology, but a statement to the airline's board itself. His words would call for accountability, for a recognition that policies and staff actions could not continue to enable disrespect. He would write about how silence had almost become the path they forced upon him, how he had been told again and again to yield for the sake of convenience. And he would make it clear that what happened on that flight was not about a single seat, but about the principle that respect is not optional. That letter would become a record of what happened, a challenge to those in power to do better, to confront the subtle ways in which authority too often sided with arrogance over fairness. He did not seek their apology, because apologies meant little without change. What he wanted was acknowledgement that the silence passengers were pressured into was itself a form of injustice, and that no one should have to choose between dignity and peace. As he walked off the plane, the air around him cooler and freer than it had felt in hours, he knew the lesson reached far beyond the cabin. The passengers who had watched now carried their own reflections, stories they might share later about the man who refused to move, about the way silence can sometimes be the easiest choice, but never the right one. The woman's humiliation, though sharp in the moment, mattered less than the truth that had been restored. And that is where the story closes, not with anger or triumph, but with a reminder etched into the memory of everyone on board. Respect must never be treated as negotiable. Silence cannot be the price of keeping peace. To stand for your dignity, even when it means grounding the world around you, is to remind everyone that some lines cannot and should not be crossed. So the call is simple, yet powerful. Do not let convenience erase your worth. Stand firm, even when it's easier to stay quiet. For it is in those moments of refusal that respect is reclaimed, and the world is reminded that dignity is never a seat to be stolen.